And subtitles.
Sure.
Where?
Captions.
Uh, Captions. Got it. Captions, language, English. Uh, I hope that's taken care of it.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. We have the token white person who's come. Thank goodness. Otherwise, we could just talk about the India-Pakistan war, or whatever the state of that is right now.
Oh,
Morning,
well, the less
Suzanne.
said, the better.
We're getting started. Rukmini, all yours.
Yeah. So, yeah, formal hello and welcome. This is the first conversation in the MindWatch series, which Ashok and I have been cooking up, and I think it's still getting cooked up, and ingredients are getting added as we go along. So, welcome to this space, and we hope that you're able to join us. Some of us are here live, and some of us are watching this later in the recording. Uh, but we hope you're able to join live as many times as possible in the coming weeks. We'll do this in the coming weeks for the next few months. Same time, Sunday. So, yeah, please do join in live as much as possible. And if you're listening to this recorded version, please reach out to us over email with your questions and comments so that we can integrate them and see how we forward together. So, my name is Rukmini. I am joining in from Mumbai in India. And in terms of my background, it's been a little over 2 decades of work in peace building on the socio political side of things and leadership and organization development on the corporate side of work. And as the years have gone along, it's been more and more of an integrated space in terms of the way I hold the work within and also the way it gets offered uh, out with my clients and the communities that I work with. Uh, Ashok and I have been speaking for a while about these conversations, and in fact, Ashok, when you first broached the idea of this particular series of conversations, uh, I remember pausing just a little bit, not so much because uh, I was not clear about the need for these conversations. I think that was very instinctively clear as well as rationally clear, but also because I wanted to be careful about uh, not stepping into yet another space where thinking becomes reduced to performance. Or your dialogue becomes a rather polite dance around difficult truths, which I see very often happening in my workspace. However, what eventually convinced me to say yes was, yeah, partly the quality of the invitation, the fact that I knew it was not driven by a sense of urgency or a need to fix anything as much as coming from a place of inquiry, also of a certain sense of rigor, both intellectually and emotionally, and a kind of moral imagination which I really cherish. And in terms of my own work with organizations and with communities, also in terms of my own inner process, I am present to the hunger um, that I notice and people around me notice for spaces where something real can happen, not in a dramatic or a reactive way, but in a very real way. And yeah, and that's the reason I eventually said yes to the series of conversations, largely because I want to make an attempt at trying to model what it means to think with someone and not think past them, uh, and to not be afraid of silence or awkwardness or not to rush to conclusions, but really to remember that the world is not something that we need to fix, but something that we are shaping every moment with everything that we do and not do, and in every conversation that we choose to have or not to have, particularly in the milieu that we are in. So, this series, therefore, is an act of reclaiming that possibility. I mean, yeah, that's the reason I'm here, Ashok. What about you?
Thank you. As always, and this is one of the reasons why I invited you and not many of the other people that I know to do this conversation with me. You are, as always, extraordinarily deliberate and thoughtful. And you're extraordinarily articulate, which is at the core of what any conversation needs to be. Uh, it's very difficult to converse with someone who is not articulate. You have to read too much into body language and their silences, and which makes sense in a more intimate relationship. But when you are talking with someone and they have trouble articulating what's in their minds, it becomes a little more harder. So thank you for accepting my invitation to collaborate on this. My name is Ashok. I think most of you know who I am. And uh, Rukmini and I share our investment in peace building and conflict resolution, but being way older than her, way more derelict than her, I also have tried to integrate into my peace building and conflict resolution my other professional interests and experience, starting with design and communication, then diversity and cross-cultural uh, management and training, and critical teaching critical and creative thinking. And finally, my last 10 to 12 years, I have been really focused on democracy. And Rukmini mentioned that this series is not has nothing to do with the urgency of the moment. But my last 12 years were literally expended in trying to address the urgency of what's happening to democracy now, way before Trump came into the picture. And now everybody and his mother-in-law is talking about saving democracy. But this conversation, these conversations, as Rukmini said, don't have anything to do with the urgency, even though you will take away the listeners, I hope, will take away from our deliberations, our slow, thoughtful uh, modeling of conversations, lessons that might help inform our current chaos and upheaval for you personally in your minds. Very important. We are not trying to solve anything. I gave up trying to solve anything years ago when I realized I am utterly insignificant. The in my From my 20s, 30s, 40s, even mid 50s, I was arrogant enough to believe that I had the tools and the skills to create major change in the world. And suddenly it hit me. It's like the poster that I remember seeing in my teens. It had this entire picture of the galaxy, entire picture of the galaxy, and the text just said, "In the infinitesimal wisdom of things, who cares?" And in a way, I don't believe we shouldn't be caring about things. Who cares what Ashok thinks? And I think for me, that's been an extraordinarily liberating thing. I'll end by saying I focus today on teaching people, the few who show up for my courses, and some of you are here, thank you for that, how to improve our thinking capabilities. As simple as that. So, long conversation, long introductions, but I think we are ready to move. So here's the thing, Rukmini. Oh, just in terms of housekeeping, sorry. Uh, feel free to put down your thoughts and your questions on chat. And make sure you address everyone. And we will, the last 10, 15, 20 minutes, take up your questions. And in this particular, for the first hour or so, we want to model a seamless, organic conversation between Rukmini and me. And I don't want it to be choppy the way Zoom conversations are, where we are constantly saying, oh, I see a comment there. And then the idea is to model the richness of a focused conversation. So, um, first off, Rukmini, I have a question, which is basic question. How do you see how do you see conversation itself? I'm not talking of dialogue. I'm not talking of communication or anything complex, but basic conversation. What? How do you see that?
Um, if I were to think of the word conversation, and it's all the more present and real to me, particularly because of what the last week has been here in India in the context of India and Pakistan and the war. Um, to some extent, I experience conversation has become the word conversation has become rather flattened in the
Mm.
world today, that we seem to use it for negotiations and interviews and podcasts and chats and all of that, right? It's a very loosely used term. Um, and having said that, for me, a real conversation is where there is a mutual willingness to be changed by what I listen to, by hear. Not necessarily to agree, but to be open to be affected, to be open to be impacted by what I hear. That to me would be a conversation. So I also find myself using that term very cautiously now, in terms of, are we rehearsing fixed positions as we so-called converse, or are we managing image or impressions, or are we genuinely arriving with our questions which are still alive, right, and which we've not killed with our own answers. So in that, the conversation has breadth in it, if that makes sense. You know, it moves. There's some silence in it. There's some movement in it, and there is a degree of risk involved in it as well. A risk to my idea of myself, and that's yeah, that to me is very essential, the conversation.
Thank you. Again, very well put. Just to add to what, I want to make sure that I don't repeat, even if what you say uh, completely resonates with me, I don't need to say it in my own words. Unless those words that I want to use are particularly distinctive. So let me just add to what you're saying, because everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. Let me, for me, and I think I complain a lot. People who know me as a disaffected person who's constantly, and all through my life, I've had problems with the way the world is. Of late, I have been, when I say late, I mean the last 20 odd years, I have been extremely impatient and frustrated with the inability of people around me to have any kind of genuinely curious conversation. Now, this is particularly noteworthy because most of my peer group are in fields like democracy, diversity, conflict resolution, peace building, and it's become almost impossible to have genuine conversations. And not just since Trump, but even before that. 10, 15, 20 years ago. In fact, I had a very curious experience. This happened a few times at Metaculture, the organization I founded, and my own staff very often, who I I selected, I brought them to India to work with me because of their master's degrees in conflict resolution and dialogue and stuff like that. They were threatened by conversation. They were threatened by any kind of conversation which forced them to move aside their script, which the script is both an educational script of knowledge as well as of morality. So I remember a conversation where we were sitting around having lunch and the question of bullying came up. And I made the comment. Obviously, I probably wasn't very skilled because I was eating dosas while talking. Uh, I said, I was bullied a lot in school, but I think it's a mistake to try to demonize bullies and bullying, as was happening particularly in the West in the 90s and early 2000s, because, and I was trying to grope for what was happening, why I was struggling with the way, particularly the highly educated elite completely demonized bullying, but they were mainly talking about boys bullying. And I was struggling with trying to understand that. And I was immediately dubbed a utterly insensitive, cruel person by my own staff who were having lunch with me. Kill the conversation. And, so for me, and you mentioned something about it not being about negotiation. The word I want to use is what passes off as conversation today between ordinary people, not a facilitated conversation, not amongst professionals. Between ordinary people, it is transactional. In other words, when I talk with people, they are either telling me about their day, their life, their job, their children, and they're giving me information. Very rarely does the conversation go into the meaning or the or a greater exploration into the context of which comes with the information. Like they want to tell you, oh, I'm really unhappy with my job, which one hears all the time. And or I can't stand my boss. He or she is so and so. And my job is to receive that information and sympathize with them. Anything else becomes a lack of acknowledgement of their pain or whatever they're going through, of their lived experience. And therefore, I am no longer worthy of being a conversational partner. Because in a transactional conversation, the other person's role is purely to give you what they want to receive. Now, for me, that's business. It's an emotional trade. It's an emotional trade, for heaven's sake. I'm coming, it's like going to a therapist and wanting some services. That's not why human beings talk to each other. Don't get me wrong. I've no problem with transactional conversation, but most conversations stop there. And so the word I want to add here into our conversation is vulnerability. And again, this is a word that everybody and his mother-in-law, father-in-law uses today. Like empathy, compassion. These are words that have been completely uh, watered down. Right? I don't see very many people who are capable of genuine vulnerability in a conversation anymore. I'll leave that uh, to you to take it wherever you want.
So sure. Yeah. Before I take it on from there, I also want to acknowledge more of us have joined in. So just to orient you, we're in the first part of the conversation, Ashok and I are in free flow. And then in the later part, we will also engage with thoughts and questions that you have. So if there are things that come up for you as you listen to us, please put them up on the chat. And yeah, Ashok, when you're speaking about vulnerability and speaking about also referencing like a therapeutic context, right? It uh, brings to me this idea of psychological safety, which is so centered in everything in the world today, workspaces or social conversations or WhatsApp groups or any space really, and the idea of safety or the lack of it is commented upon so much. And I also sometimes find a sense of entitlement around it. Um, and and don't get me wrong. I mean, as a psychologist, I get the need for it, uh, and I know there are certain contexts of conversations where that's absolutely not negotiable. That safety is required. And having said that, I often wonder what is it that has made us lose the capacity for uh, courage, for lack of a better term, uh, in spaces. I mean, why do we feel so not safe that we demand that sense of safety anywhere and everywhere that we go to an extent where it can come across as a sense of entitlement? Right? And I imagine part of that is because of the world that we are living in, where there is genuinely a sense of physical threat to a lot of us, and therefore we are perhaps projecting that sense of safety and the need for it
Everywhere.
everywhere. Uh, and that is a reality that needs to be acknowledged. Um, and to add to that, that there's also been a huge amount of democratization of language around trauma and triggers and boundaries and all of that, right? And that coupled with uh, the woke culture is a rather deadly mix in terms of what it does to the idea of a conversation, right? In the sense that it, to me, it brings up this question around if we hold the idea of conversations the way you and I are holding, Ashok, in that it needs to leave room for us to be impacted and changed, and sometimes identities might get broken in the process. Um, is there room for that if all we are focused on is psychological safety, which then means conversations can become performative in nature? So, yeah, so when I'm thinking of what makes a real conversation unsafe, in the sense that it breaks down the very ethos of a conversation, for me, it is, yeah, this kind of safety that pushes us into our comfort zones and makes us stay there in a way that there is no room for discomfort, there's no room for contradiction or rupture. And that can really disintegrate the idea of a conversation. Uh, Perhaps even hearing this might be triggering to some of
Of
us,
course,
and I
of
want,
course, of course.
yeah. And at the same time, that there's a huge lack of opportunity if we don't allow for uh, that sense of risk in a conversation, because uh, if a conversation does not touch something that is unguarded within us, then there is no connection
That's the point.
involved.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just want to, I was just telling you this before we got started. Yesterday, I had the privilege of very briefly meeting uh, Azar Nalisi, Azar Nalisi, who many of you may know as the author of the book Reading Lolita in Tehran. It was at a symposium held by the Goethe Institute for Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize winning writer and human rights activist, his 150th birth anniversary. And she said, and she escaped the Iranian Revolution and came to the US. And for her, in the late 70s or early 80s, when she came to the US, she was, America was the Mecca of democracy and free speech. And all the things that the Iranian Revolution, the Khomeinis, the mullahs were doing, she was so angry, upset, and she came to the US and discovered that in American universities and in civil society, there was extraordinary censorship. It wasn't the government that was censoring American thinking and speech. It was civil society and academics because of safe spaces. Now, mind you, the idea of safe spaces has been around for 50 odd years. And even in the late 70s, she sensed it, and she was, uh, um, and she was the only person in the whole symposium, foreigner, mind you, who could. And I went to her, and she's very old, and she looked a little frail. I held her hands, and I said, "Thank you so much for saying what you did, because you're the only one here who understands what democracy is." Everyone else is having a blast of a time attacking Trump as though he is the primary threat to democracy. And given my work in democracy, the deterioration of American democracy started way before Trump came into the picture. You know. Anyway, so yes, this uh, let's go back to, because I know that Anuradha asked a question about the difference between dialogue and debate. And I wanted to start today's conversation talking about conversation itself. And you've raised a couple of points, and I want to touch on them before we move from conversation to dialogue or debate, or even throw in the word argument there. Uh, I forget the exact words you used, Rukmini, but you alluded to something about, and I'm using my own words, uh, autonomy. And the here's okay. Let me just put it the way I understand this particular concept. I've been thinking a lot about what enables us to be intelligent, because even before we talk about conversation, we have to step back. What are we thinking? What do we need to share? Am I just sharing the physical impact of the world on my body? Like I'm hungry, I'm hurting, or do I have anything more to say? I remember making a poster. I love making posters coming back from my design days. Uh, a poster I made like a protest placard was, if you have nothing to say, don't say it. Really, which is like a completely offensive thing to tell to people who believe everyone should have a voice all the bloody time. It's like, seriously. I mean, have we devalued speech so much that we should be talking all the time? No one says you should be eating all the time, okay, or drinking or whatever. Isn't speech far more valuable? And shouldn't we be very careful about sharing stuff in the world? Okay, so which is not to say that I'm not romanticizing the strong silent types. No, So to come back to it, I want to make a connection and explore this connection between conversation, which is speech, and thought. And I think part of the problem with humans in general throughout history has been that, and I say this is again going to be very offensive, most people are not capable of original thought. But let me just spend a minute or two on this. What do I mean by original thought? If I'm hungry and I say I'm hungry, oh, and I also want a burger, that burger is my personal wish to satisfy my physical need for hunger. Fair enough. I want burger or a banana or whatever. It isn't necessarily an original thought. The idea of a burger is already there in my head. And when someone says, I hate Trump or I hate Hillary Clinton, there's no originality in that thought. That's they've already embedded that idea in their head and they're just bringing it out at a particular place in the conversation, right? I see most conversations as the articulation of pre-packaged ideas. In other words, whether it's our experience or our education or the last thing we read on the internet, it's there in our mind and we spew it out. And we've created linkages or connections between our childhood experience, what we studied in college, theorists we liked very much, and what's happening in Ukraine and what I experienced or read today. And these connections are happening automatically in the mind. I'm not working hard to make those connections. So when I talk, the odds are that my brain is making these connections automatically, and my mouth is literally like a puppet mouthing them. And I think I am thinking, and my talk is a result of my thinking. So, where am I going with this? And I'm going to stop now because I want to pick this up later and I don't want to talk for too long about this. But let me try to summarize this. I think the reason why you and I are struggling with the paucity of real conversation is because there's very little real thought. Almost everything that people, including me, voice has has been processed. Okay? And the problem with processed thought coming out as speech is that there are two problems. The first is I haven't really invested my mind power, my processing power, my own power in changing it. The second problem with processed thought is that because it comes without much processed ideas, is that because it comes without much thought, it becomes part of who I am, my identity. And if it's a part of who I am, then, oh my God, can't challenge that. I can't have that challenged because it's an assault on who I am, you know? And whereas, and in my own case, and I'll stop with this, in my own case, when I talk about things that are important to me, because they've already been processed, mind you, I'm far more defensive. When I am actively thinking through idea and processing with immense struggle, personal struggle, cognitive effort goes into it. And I share that. One would imagine I should be more defensive because I've put so much into it. But actually, I'm less defensive because it's a hypothesis. I mean, that's the nature of science. A scientist doesn't tell you the truth. This is another misconception of science. The scientist merely puts forth a hypothesis that is meant to be tested. I think the problem with most people and their sacred ideas is they haven't been tested. They have come out of their lived experience, their education, uh, their emotional response to the world, and they have crystallized as anti-racism or anti-sexism or something, and then that's presented to the world as an idea, except it is their literally emotional response to the world. So I'm just going to start. I've spoken too much.
So, a lot of threads to pick up on there. Um, yeah, one thing I'm present to is also the idea of worldviews, but I'm feeling a little shy about using that word also because it gets very easily interpreted as Eastern versus Western and all of that. And that's bracketing it a little too much. But I think a lot of our systems as we experience them in the world today and perhaps in the last few decades. And by systems, I mean our educational systems, our families, our corporate and other kind of social systems. So many of them are built around pillars of identity. And so the work, our work in the world is perceived as being about building our identity and then guarding it, right? And when that happens, when if I am indoctrinated into that, when do I really have the opportunity to encounter myself? Because all I'm encountering or all I'm talking to is the garb that I wear, in the form of these various identities that I have either inherited or in some cases chosen uh, for reasons of convenience or practicality more than the fact that I'm convinced about those identities. And in a world like that, there's really no opportunity to either encounter myself or encounter the other, right? So it's more or less like, that there's a lot of memes circulating off late of these AI bots talking to each other, right? One person's AI agent talking to another person's AI agent, and that's more or less what we've been doing, I think, in the last few decades, in the name of conversation. In that there's one identity talking to the other identity, uh, and there's only so far that can go, because beyond a point, identities start feeling threatened if there is another perspective that comes into play. And when that happens, it's labeled as violence. And then when there's violence, there's offense and defense. And it goes into a dance which is not necessarily uh, productive, I think. And I've been very present to what do we really mean by violence and what does it mean to counter violence in the last week. Um, Also because of thoughts I've been posting on social media, uh, in the context of what was happening between India and Pakistan, and some of the responses to those thoughts were about being called an urban naxal and anti-national and all of that. And there was a lot of conversation within myself around saying, what is violence? And if I were to counter it, what does that even mean? And yeah, very often, peace tends to be offered as this polarity to violence, as a
Right.
counter to it. And uh, yeah, I, I think it feels like that cannot be it, right? I mean, peace is a constant aspiration that we need to hold, and it can never be an established state of being either within myself or out there in the world. So if not peace, what then? And one idea I've been staying with, therefore, is would volunteerism be a counter to violence in that if I were to not feel that the world is out to attack me in every conversation, can I volunteer to say, hey, here's an idea I hold, and I volunteer to for you to break it down and see if there's an alternative, if there are other possibilities that you could help me see and explore. And that to me is a critical aspect of democracy as well, right? If we are to have conversations around democracy, are we really also building competence for each one of us to be able to volunteer our identities, volunteer our beliefs, our thought processes, and say, hey, here's this thing up for offer. Can we break it down? And can we deconstruct it and see what works for all of us? And there's very little capacity building around that, honestly, either through our conventional educational mechanisms or through any other informal systems that we have right now.
I love the idea of volunteerism. I've not used that word to describe what you are saying, and it's absolutely vital. And I think there are two or three things that come to mind. Classical Western education. Big fan of classical Western education, which doesn't exist anymore, was based on the Enlightenment values of reason and debate and dialogue. So I go back to this because when I was the Indian educational system in when I was growing up was modeled around the old British one, and while it was absolutely crappy in so many ways, there was one that we still grew up with the idea of creating the well-rounded human being. My dad's generation, particularly, even in casual conversation, they would talk about students that they admired. It was never me. Uh, and say, oh, he's so well rounded, or she's so well rounded. And because that was the ideal of the classical British and then even American education. Now, to be a well rounded person, you had to be a generalist. You couldn't be a specialist because a specialist has jagged or hard edges. Okay. And uh, the essence of Western education coming out of the Enlightenment, but also from Greek philosophy, whether it's Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, was that was based on the idea of dialogue, was based on the idea that firstly it was based on the idea of skepticism. Forgive me, not dialogue. And skepticism, totally different from cynicism. Skepticism meant to look at the whole world with a question mark. And the dialogic model was to take those questions and pose them to people. Socratic questioning was based on that principle that everything, and this is way before the Enlightenment and science developed, uh, the, the wisdom there was that you really didn't know anything. And it is in dialogue with other fellow human beings. And of course, through observation of the world. It's very, very important. Observing the world with all your senses and then taking those insights and in dialogue with other people, understanding what was really happening. Okay. So that meant, and this is the huge takeaway from me from both the Greek era as well as the post-Enlightenment Western educational system, that questioning the world was considered necessary. And if I could question the world, by Jove, I should be questioning myself too. If the entire world is up for grabs in terms of how I understand it, what makes me think that I know anything concrete? The idea of certainty was what the Enlightenment era was fighting against. Certainty coming out of Christian certainty. The pre-Enlightenment, pre-Reformation Christianity, which was extremely dogmatic. So the Enlightenment era was an attempt to break away from the extremely repressive, oppressive, dogmatic ideology that governed society. Now, I just want to add one more thing in this. Now, it's very important that, and I realized this only later, you see, because the mistake I make all the time is in thinking that where I am, either the world is also there, or that I'm in the right place and others should get there. That's a basic misconception I always harbor, and I'm probably doing that now too. So it took me it took me a while, given my interest in communication and human rights and democracy and dialogue. I took for granted, I want to say until about 5 to 10 years ago, that communication and conversation and dialogue are natural to human beings. Meaning, deep is natural, and we have somehow lost it. And the world needed me and people like me as facilitators to make that happen. But as I said, I have been delving into the history of political systems and the history of social development. And one of the things that struck me is that we need dialogue and conversation now because we have completely fragmented the world. In other words, my grandparents, for instance, didn't need anything more than gentle. They needed transactional conversation and they needed gentle hearing of each other's views, which may or may not have happened. I don't think my grandmother could talk to my grandfather and receive any serious acknowledgement because of, his patriarchal, because of the patriarchal environment that existed. But neither my grandmother nor my grandfather, or I want to say, even until my parents in their 50s, they never had to question either what the world was or who they were in the world. So because it had existed for generations. And there was a way in which the deep conversations may have been about politics. And there were very few people from, at least that I know from my father's generation, who were genuinely philosophic to have deep, meaningful philosophic conversations. There were very few people. They didn't really need to, because in a way, they they were nurtured and given a very clear idea of what the world was and what was expected of them. And to be a good human was to be a good person was to follow your path, the path that you were born into, with as much diligence and integrity as possible. But by the uh, by the 60s, my parents' world had been hit with globalization. Globalization actually started there. I want to say not globalization, hypermobility. People were moving across India and then even outside the country. People were starting to realize their professions were unstable. Their children, like me, okay, we became alien creatures that they had to figure out. Literally, it's like, who the hell is Ashok? The 13 or 15-year-old, he is not conforming to any idea of what a son should be. So my parents needed to talk with me, but they'd never had a conversation in their lives, the kind of conversation you and I are talking about. So they were literally fumbling, groping, uh, totally inchoate people trying to understand their teenage son. But they need it, meaning suddenly conversation had become important. Dialogue had become important, but nobody, least of all me, had the tools. Now, fast forward to 2025. Everything has changed. I mean, leave alone the fact that we don't even have the basic attention of a goldfish right now. I mean, there is nothing, forget a child who is born today, but even you and I can't hold on to anything, including our physical safety. And therefore, we need conversation. We need complex, deep conversations. We don't know who we are. We don't know what the world is. And again, going back to my analogy of, my brain is still, each one of our brains is making those connections. And because we have so little self reflective capabilities, or even, at least of all, metacognitive capabilities, uh, we are unable to even see how our brain is processing the world. And therefore, when we talk, not only is not only are prepackaged ideas coming out into the world, we don't even understand how those ideas have occurred and have coalesced in our minds. So, I mean, of course, we are defensive about it because, oh my God, how can you attack something that seems so integral to me and the way I see the world? This has to be the truth. In other words, we need conversation today to survive. I don't think my parents needed conversation to survive. I'll just give this example. I was one of those kids where I always preferred the company of adults to that of my peer group, even as a 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old. By the time I was 15, I would complain to my parents. Can you imagine a 15-year-old teenager who's rebellious complaining to my parents if they didn't take me to visit the houses of adults that I like? I wanted to be in the presence of adults who were talking about interesting things. When I look back, what they shared, and it was fascinating for me, was information about the world. There was very little of what you and I are talking about as deep conversation, almost zero. But that was all they needed. How do you hear what I'm saying? And is there anything in your life that you can connect to it?
As you're talking about this kind of a need for conversations, which is not about transacting or getting things done, but really conversation that leads to relating. And in the process of relating, there is, of course, impact, and perhaps we change in the process of going through that impact. Uh, for that kind of a relationship to happen with a person, with a group, with a community, uh, there needs to be a sense of grounding, right?
Hmm.
And and a sense of knowing where where am I rooted, uh, and and as you were sharing about your childhood, I'm thinking of growing up in the 80s and 90s in India and in what used to be a British colony. A lot of the books I read as a child spoke of things like ginger beer and apple juice and muffins, and which didn't really exist in India, back then where I was growing up, right? I mean, around me there was probably like bhel puri and mangoes and
Haji.
whatever. Right? That's not what we talk in the books, and we've had generations of people like me who've grown up psychologically displaced because what we were educated into and what we learned was not our world outside. So therefore, I think a lot of, at least my conversations when I look back to my teen years or in my 20s, were probably about the world I aspired to and not, not so much the world that I actually was physically located in. And so, how can the conversations even be real? Because how, because I'm talking about things that ought to be and I want it to be, and uh, right, I'm not located in the here and now because that's not where I'm taught to be located. Um, so y- yeah, in this moment, as I reflect on that, it feels like I'm rather disenfranchised from this right to conversation that perhaps we are
Yes, sir.
born with.
I love that line, disenfranchised from the right to conversation. I just love it. Keep going, keep going.
So that then perhaps, I mean, looking back at myself, I'm also thinking about um, what values do I live out when I attempt to be in conversation, uh, in the sense that if I feel like my all my conversations are an attempt to make myself relevant to the world and make the world relevant to me, just to belong and to ground myself, then then of course I need to convince myself that I'm going into this conversation from a space of either proving a point or performing uh, or a sense of modesty that we're often uh, asked to adopt, right? And I'm wondering if it's important to distinguish between modesty and humility,
Mm, mm.
and the fact that if I really have to be in conversation, I perhaps need to espouse the value of humility and acknowledge that I possibly cannot know everything, uh, and I possibly cannot hold everything that comes to me in a conversation, and that's okay. And that means that I may end up being in conversations where there is no closure. There may be conversations where I don't feel like I won at the end of it,
Right, right, right,
or
right,
there's
right.
no sense of comfort or agreement at the end of it. And that's okay if I am genuinely humble. But do I have the capacity for it? Um, Maybe a little bit, but there is a lot of work to be done around that.
Absolutely. Uh, Another day, we should discuss the difference between modesty and humility. I think that's a great distinction. And I loved, as I said, your use of the word disenfranchised from rights. And you're also talking about being uprooted or unrooted. And I have to say that I have felt for many years totally untethered. The word I've been using is untethered. And I think this, at least people in their 20s and 30s can blame the world for being untethered, for their being untethered, because everything has happened to them. The internet, the globalization, it's like all their roots had been hacked away before they were born. But people like me, and I'm hearing you too, we are the product of an alien culture which still existed in India. For me, 20 years longer than for you. And my whole life was one of aspiration for something that was not my home. And uh, this is why, now when I think about it, this is why I desperately need conversation. I desperately need dialogue. This is why when I discovered in the late 80s, when I discovered the idea of teaching through facilitation and through that, the idea of dialogue, it was like, oh my God, this is better than sex, almost. Because and it took me a few more decades to figure this out. Because it was only in deep conversations that I tethered myself. I was able to anchor myself. Otherwise, I have been adrift. I'm still totally adrift in the world. in Washington, D.C. right now. Okay? There's not even a pretense of uh, any kind of roots. Okay? Even though I've been here for 8 years. Uh, so, yes, this is a good place for us to segue into the conversation, the questions, and the thoughts that our lovely, if you listeners have. So, I would encourage all of you folks to put down on chat any thoughts. They don't have to be just questions, any thoughts, any reflections, any questions, and we will pick up on that. I would like to start with the difference between dialogue and debate. But before that, can I ask you, Rukmini, how do you see the difference between conversation and debate? The conversation we are talking about, deep, meaningful conversation and debate. How do you see the difference between that? We'll go to dialogue a little later.
Debate has its place in the world in that if one really wants to uh, deep dive and really explore, let's say, two polarities, there is a lot of utility of debate in terms of two people or two parties choosing to hold the, those two positions and then talking from there in a way that it deepens our understanding of both of those positions, right? And the repercussions on the world for both of those positions. And a good, genuine debate might even allow for a very beautiful synthesis to occur at the end of it, because it's like a mining process, right? You're mining for the best of both perspectives and then bringing it together. So there is definitely value in that. And if I were to juxtapose the idea of conversation in the way we're talking about, uh, a conversation to me does not necessarily have to be about holding polarities.
Right,
Right?
right,
It does
right.
not have to be about proving a
Mm.
point. It is just about, to me, it would be about really co-sensing the world,
The term that comes
right?
to mind, sorry to interrupt, but the term that comes to my mind is uh, exploring deeper understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah, a conversation. Sorry, mutual exploration is what comes to mind.
yeah, mutual exploration of reality. And for
Right.
me to be capable of that exploration, what are the muscles I need to launch into that exploration? What are the capacities that I need to build in a way that I am able to really step into that exploration? That remains a question.
Great. Can I invite all of you to do one or both of two things? Put down your thoughts and questions on chat, but you can also, I would invite you to put on your video, and maybe we can even, because there's a small group, we can even talk with each other. So thank you. And thank you, Suzanne, for your point. I want to touch on the second part of Anuradha's, which is no, we still haven't defined dialogue. So, what's dialogue, and how is it different from conversation for you, Rukmini?
May I
Yeah, yes,
may I say
of
something?
course, of course.
Sorry, I'm not switching on my video because
Okay,
you'll see very soon. Rukmani knows this is my granddaughter's sleeping time, so I'm trying to put her to sleep while listening
okay,
to you. So sorry about that.
no problem.
Um, so the flyer that Rukmini had posted in Facebook, that's where she had written about dialogue and debate, the difference between dialogue and debate, and that set me thinking. And all our educational systems, we are taught to debate, but we are not taught to dialogue,
Right.
right? And um, uh, In fact, I even observed once in a Tibetan Buddhist temple where the monks, uh, uh, the way they learn is by debating
Right.
on a particular theme or a particular topic, and
Right.
it's fascinating to see the way they do it,
Right.
you know. So that is why it got me thinking, and that's why I was putting
Q.
that. But I like the way you were started with conversations. Yes, and I was thinking even at this primary systems that we are belong to, family systems that you also spoke about, Ashok, there is hardly any conversation that takes place really in our
Thank you.
families and yeah.
Thank you, Anuradha. We want to delve into your question per se. So, Rukmini, your take on what's the difference between conversation and dialogue? Let's get our definitions right.
Um, I suppose I've been uh, working with both of those terms in a rather fluid manner, but if I were to distinguish and articulate that distinction for myself, it would be, um, I mean, if I were to think of the professional dialogue contexts that I engage with in conflict zones and so on, um, I would think that if I'm stepping into a dialogue, I have an expectation that when I step out of it, I might be rearranged, reconfigured in terms of my thoughts, in terms of my emotions, uh, perhaps even as a person in the longer run around it, because not because I was necessarily convinced with another viewpoint, but because something in me was witnessed in the process of the dialogue, and even if it may have been challenging, that witnessing changes me because it adds a layer of experience which was not present early on. And yeah, that to me is a space of dialogue, which of course also means that I step into a dialogue uh, not knowing what it will bring, uh, also knowing that I might come out disoriented or with a lot of questions about the world and my own self, which I previously did not have. And that can be deeply uncomfortable, but that's also the greatest opportunity in dialogue for me. That leads to discovery of new encounters with myself and with others, and a new way of relating to the world, which adds to experience, which adds to newer relationships with life broadly. Um, yeah, and of course, it even as I say that, it's yeah, dialogue is not a method or a technique, right? It's a way of being with the world, really, and it's constant and it's consistent.
Love it. Uh, I I want to just say that the only I mean I'm now coming to it's fair to say that I have some of my own ideas have about these topics have become a little more clearer right now in this conversation. And I am tempted to say that dialogue is merely formalized conversation. That uh, conversation is organic and can go anywhere. And it relates to what Suzanne asked. She asked a very good question. It seems like we brought up multiple salient points and then responded to each other's ideas that might have personally resonated. What is the goal to this type of conversation, and how is it different from focusing more deliberately on a specific idea? And that is the difference between conversation and dialogue. I think, in a way, the first part of what you said, Suzanne, is what we are trying to model here. This is why I call the event MindWatch, which is self explanatory, metacognition, and conversations. I deliberately didn't want to put dialogue because dialogue is it's It can be very often goal directed. And whatever that goal might be, it can even mean enhancing understanding. But conversations are more organic, more fluid, more spontaneous. And naturally, this is not as organic as a spontaneous one that just shows up when two people meet, because we are uh, setting it up, we are inviting you, there's some protocol here. So to that extent, it's not spontaneous. But I think both Rukmini and I are trying very hard to keep the flow of conversation as organic as possible. Which is why, even though we had a few questions that we had thought up in advance, other than the first question, we didn't actually even go there. And this is what I'm hoping for, that we don't need maybe anything other than the topic to, uh, as the phrase that Rukmini used right in the beginning, to think together. And I've used this term for a long time in critical thinking, dialogic thinking, that most often thinking happens in one's mind. And that's precious. That's very difficult. My prejudice is that most people don't know how to think and almost never think. They just respond to stuff that's based on whatever is in their heads. So thinking in one's mind is a phenomenal thing. And humans can do that. And as far as we know, no other species can. But thinking with another human is an even more interesting phenomenon. And ideally, conversations and dialogue and debate allow for thinking with someone else. And unfortunately, we seem to have lost that capacity. I also want to put out something else that is potentially offensive. I realize that not only have I become in my 60s an extremely offensive person to most people, but every idea of mine is potentially offensive. So here's another offensive idea. Thinking is a very elitist activity. So is conversation and dialogue. I don't say it's not for the masses, but the masses cannot do it. They don't have the time. It's a luxury. They have better things to do, as a matter of fact. And the ones who have the luxury don't know how to do it. So, yes. So, Suzanne, we will, from next meet, from the next conversation onwards, we will take discrete topics. Subsequent conversations are not going to be about conversations and dialogue. They are going to be about specific topics that are of concern to your lives and ours. About the world, about politics, about economics, about geopolitics, about philosophy, about spirituality. We want to be very eclectic in the topics we select, but we want to try to have conversations about it, not debate, even though I wouldn't have a problem, Rukmani, if sometimes the conversation gets into trying to negotiate between polarities. Okay, because you and I both recognize that debate is not a horrible thing, as many dialogue facilitators in the 90s and early 2000s used to go about demeaning debate and prioritizing or privileging dialogue. I think that's a very unnecessary and artificial distinction. Uh, but yes, we will be talking about those things. Uh, Now, I want to uh, go to Peter's comment regarding the question of engaging in a way that can enable one or both to be influenced and changed. What can allow another to be vulnerable, to be influenced or changed through conversation? What about this need people assert to feel safe in a conversation in order for one to be able, willing to be vulnerable? Is the expressed need to feel safe a foil for being defensive and guarded and unwilling to be influenced? You take it, Rukmini.
Hmm. I would think a lot of this need for safety and safe spaces is fed into us because if we did not feel that need, we would not feel the need for systems and structures around us. The only way systems around us can sustain themselves is by convincing us that we need to be safe, and the existing systems are where we find that safety. And yeah, the way the system then lives in us and embodies through us is through identity and yeah, through all of these aspects of our yeah, various forms of identities, and we keep inventing new forms of them. I think it's the way the system, the existing systems in the world sustain themselves. That's how I see the need for safety. If we were genuinely uh, feeling a sense of uh, belonging, and therefore know that no matter how much I shift and no matter how much the world shape shifts around me, I'm still here. I still belong in life. If I were to approach life from that perspective, our systems would be constantly in a state of flux, and that is yeah, for a system that has been invested in so much, that's very threatening to it, right? That idea of flux. And yeah, so in that sense, a lot of what we speak about in terms of AI systems taking over the world and machines taking
Right.
over the world, right? That projection perhaps comes from the fact that we already live in a world where the system has taken over, right? And we are living that reality
You
in
know,
one way.
can I say that I see it a little different?
Yes.
And meaning I agree with what you're saying, but the twist in my own mind is human beings have always had very rigid systems. Okay. And we have been conservative through most of our history until recently. Meaning your ancestors and my ancestors and the ancestors of Eskimos have conservatism was necessary for them for the reasons you said, because they had to live in a particular way within a given system. They didn't have a choice. So survival required conservatism. Okay. And again, to go to conversations didn't need to be particularly deep because there was nothing deep to be explored. Everything was a given. Now we come to 2025 where everything has been shattered. And my theory, so in other words, it's not that the systems have taken over. I believe we live in a place, in a time where the systems have all broken down, and our need for safety is coming out of primarily the West, which has destroyed everything, including the biological family, and tried to create political systems in its place. Political systems based on feminism or multiculturalism or postmodernism or non-binary, and we've created what I call our completely inorganic and artificial and ideological systems to replace the biological historic systems that human beings have always lived under. We've created this coming out of our academies and our Marxists and leftists and feminist thought. We've created this mostly in the West and mostly amongst the college educated West. And then, because these systems are so tenuous, because they are completely artificial. I mean, many people I talk with define themselves as anti-racist, anti-sexist, and non-Islamophobic. What is their idea of who they are? Their morality is based on those things. And a tenuous system that gives them some identity and gives them purpose. Like for the longest, my identity was as a free thinking liberal. It is only recently that I started realizing that's crap. That doesn't mean anything, you know? Uh, and uh, coming back to this whole idea of, yes, we have created our world an artificial world with rules and norms, and we are required to follow that to the T. Otherwise, we become unsafe, and the people who we are holding on to desperately as our community, because we don't have families anymore. We have communities, intentional communities of like minded people. They've all bought into these very same norms and laws, artificial ones. And we can't challenge any of that because they would feel unsafe. And if they feel unsafe, they will get rid of you because they can't have dissent within that. This, for me, means the need for safety is because people like me are utterly rootless. I realized some years ago that I was, to use a academic word, deracinated or deracinated. I'm not part of my roots at all. I have nothing. And therefore, even the slightest thing can completely shatter my idea of being safe or secure. We have 6 minutes, and I'm wondering if each of you could put down on chat a thought or a question that you want all of us to leave with. And please do that. And Rukmini, can I invite you to give your kind of closing ruminations about our conversation today? Take it
The, the,
anywhere
que-
you want to.
yeah. uh, the questions that have come up, particularly from Peter and Suzanne, bring me to this idea of purpose and how we are so colonized by the idea of purpose, in that a conversation needs to have a purpose if we are to be responsible in our use of time, or our communities to have a purpose, and our systems have to have a purpose, and so on, right? And uh, if we are colonized by the idea of purpose, particularly in conversations, can there really be real conversations? Because then that there's an agenda, and we're solving for that agenda through the conversation. The conversation then becomes a tool for something, and if the conversation is a tool, that then I'm also not really doing any real thinking there, because all I'm doing is drawing upon what I already know, and attempting to repurpose it in a way that it'll serve the purpose of the conversation. So uh, I'm also thinking of what would it take to decolonize myself of purpose in a conversation, and is there the possibility of finding joy in conversation for the sake of it, right? Not without an agenda, not without a sense of purpose coming into play.
Listening to you, uh, yeah, uh, yeah, it's disturbing how few conversations I have. And it's also disturbing how much I need conversation. In other words, I really mean it. I'm desperate for conversation. And I think it's because it is an act of intimacy. You know, in fact, many years ago, it struck me that a deep conversation is far more intimate than sex. Far more. There's no comparison, you know? And it's such a shame that uh, the elite have lost their capacity to converse. As I say, it is that kind of deep conversation is an elitist thing, and the elite have lost it. So, in other words, is there any real conversation left in the world? I don't know. You know, uh, uh, Suzanne, we have only a couple of you here. So, Suzanne, do you want to unmute and just share your closing thoughts? Then Peter and then Anuradha.
Yeah, so I was just typing them out. So, like you, Ashok, I too am desperate for deep conversation. Um, and what really resonated the most with me today in this conversation was Rukmini's ideas about being open to and being affected by, being willing to be affected by, um, and changed by that kind of like an interaction with another person on a conversational level. Like if you're not willing to be changed or open to what the other person is saying, then just walk away and be by yourself. Like what are you doing? Right. Yeah. And then so that brings to mind how we can habitually set ourselves up for taking that stance in conversations when the world we live in is just routinely fast paced and transactional, which is what's leading to the alienation. So it's kind of like, it just goes round and round and round until you deliberately interrupt it. So I'm wondering how at this point. But yes, well done, you two.
Thank you. Hope you keep coming. Peter.
Well, I'm just thinking that, simply stated, when we're having a conversation with another person, there's two conversations. One is the information and the differences of view and what we're the words and the meanings and all that. And the other is, who are we? I mean, this is very fundamental, and I know both of you have waxed on this whole session, but the identity question and how that's what I was saying earlier, that it takes so much effort to help the person not feel frail. Identities are so brittle. And because there's often that refuge people take about the safety of being not judged, and who are you to make anything that provokes me to question my deeper sense of self? I guess I feel the futility of trying to influence people. That's my closing comment.
No, but thank you so much for saying that, because in a way, that's what prompted me to, with Rukmini, offer this as a opportunity and a platform. Because in our lives and in my life, there is no conversation. And uh, uh, even attempting, even on a specific topic, when I invited people about 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, to a conversation about Trump and what he was doing, he was shattering the world. And a few people came. And when I asked someone, what do you think? He got upset. Why are you putting me on the spot? I said, why did you come for this conversation if you didn't want to? Uh,
Yes.
uh, yeah, because all I was doing was asking, hey, Mr. R, what do you think about this? I don't like being put on the spot. It's like, why have you shown up?
Essence.
Experience for me was the most outrageously extreme example of feeling his safety was being assaulted. Most people, it's like, can you substantiate what you're saying? How dare you challenge me? So that one can understand that in some way. Anuradha, would you like to talk about your response to this whole conversation?
Yeah, just to respond to what you said earlier, why people come is, one is fear of missing out, something important happening. So, oh God, that is one. And secondly, not put to just gather information, So therefore, in asking them what do they think is putting them in a spot. Many people feel that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, many people feel that, and I too think that deep conversations is so not there in the world now. It is see what I see deep conversations in the type of um, uh, human process work that I do. And there, that connect which happens between people in a very deep sense of the that is something that it is not there at all. And that can happen only when one is willing to really open oneself up totally, you know. Where does that happen really? And so I too agree with what Suzanne said. I think it'll be great to participate in this kind of a uh, space, really. Uh,
Wonderful.
yeah, thank you.
No, thank you, Anu, if I can call you Anu. And I would
Yes, please.
encourage, yes, thank you. I would encourage you to tell other people, others who you think are yearning for conversation. Please tell people. And, I don't know what an optimal size would be, but uh, I think we need way more people to make this uh, really to create genuine cross fertilization. So I'll put it that way. And I want to end by just thanking Rukmini. Rukmini, I haven't for a very long time collaborated with someone to create something. And uh, when I thought of you, it felt right given our interactions in the past. But particularly after this, I think you're a find for me. So thank you so much for agreeing to uh, partner with me on this. And uh, please, folks, please tell others. And Rukmani, feel free to chime in. And in any case, can you stay back after the others leave so we just quickly debrief?
Of
So
course, yeah.
how would you decide on the theme for the next session? You would decide on it, or how will
Great.
you announce it ahead? Or
Right.
so
Thank you.
I was curious to know that also. Yeah,
Thank you. I forgot
yeah.
to say this.
Thank you.
I forgot to say this, so thank you for reminding me, Anu. I want each one of you to send us by email your suggestions. Anything you want to talk about, anything you're curious
Mm.
about. Now, we have our own topics, but frankly, it would be so much richer if you contribute the topic. So please send as many as you want, okay? Uh, Speaking for myself, there is no topic that I think is not interesting enough. And there's no topic I would personally be afraid to talk about or think through, even if it loses me people. I'm being very clear about that. Rukmini,
So, Shuk, not much to add except, yeah, it was a joyful conversation for me.
yeah,
And also to respond to Anu's comment on the chat around having conversations without a purpose other than just understanding the self and the other, I might tweak it as an invitation to say, how about conversations without a purpose other than just encountering oneself and the other, right? I might sometimes not even understand. I may walk away being flummoxed or disgusted or confused or any of that. And there is an experience in there as well, right? Even without a sense of understanding. And in Sanskrit, there's this term called rasa. I'm really not sure how to translate that into English. I mean, the literal translation would be juice, but not in the
yeah,
literal juice sense of the term, right? But that there is juice in life, even in a sense of disgust, even in a sense of confusion and anger, and right, and of course, in all the pleasant things that we experience, and yeah, a mixture of all of these juices makes it healthy. So yeah, opening ourselves up to that kind of an experience is what I would invite all of us into.
awesome. What a great word to end this with. Rasa, uh, crudely translated as juice. Thanks, Anu, Peter, Suzanne, and the couple of others who also came. Hope to see you next week. And please send us any topics you might personally find worthwhile conversing on.
Thank
Ta-da.
you. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Rukmini. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Okay, Rukmini, how are you doing?
Do you want to start
How-
recording?
Oh, right. I'm so sorry. This is me. Now, see, I have to look for the recording button because stop